Hey guys, tonight we descend into the cloistered, complex, and occasionally controversial world of medieval nuns, where spirituality, power, and human nature collided in ways that would make modern reality TV producers weep with envy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval religious life. When most people picture medieval nuns, they imagine silent, pious women gliding through stone corridors, hands clasped in prayer, faces hidden beneath heavy veils. That's right, the stereotypical image of the devoted, self-denying bride of Christ, completely removed from worldly concerns. Sound familiar? It should, because it's the sanitized version of history that conveniently ignores the messy human reality of convent life. Let's be clear about something from the start. Medieval nunneries weren't spiritual boot camps filled with willing martyrs. They were complex institutions that served multiple functions in society, sometimes spiritual retreats, sometimes finishing schools for noble daughters, sometimes convenient dumping grounds for inconvenient women, and occasionally hotbeds of political intrigue, financial corruption, and yes, sexual scandal that would make a soap opera writer blush. To be fair, many nuns genuinely sought spiritual fulfillment and found it within convent walls. But the medieval world was nothing if not complicated, and the reality of monastic life reflected the broader tensions of a society caught between Christian ideals and human desires. These weren't just religious institutions. They were economic powerhouses, political entities, and social safety nets all rolled into one. If you thought the modern world invented institutional dysfunction, think again. Medieval convents had it all. Embezzlement scandals that would make modern CEOs jealous, political machinations that rivaled any corporate boardroom, and romantic entanglements that put contemporary dating apps to shame. And yet, paradoxically, these same institutions produced some of history's most influential mystics, scholars, and reformers. The story we're about to tell spans roughly 8 centuries, from the early medieval period through the Protestant Reformation. We'll travel from the foggy hills of Ireland to the sun-baked stones of Spanish convents, from the political powerhouses of German abbeys to the scandal-ridden nunneries of Renaissance Italy. Meanwhile, we'll discover that the line between sacred and profane was often much blurrier than anyone wanted to admit. Of course, we need to approach this topic with nuance. The medieval period wasn't a monolith. What was true in 12th century France wasn't necessarily true in 14th century England. Similarly, not all convents were created equal. Some maintained rigorous standards throughout their existence, while others became notorious for their laxity. Still, patterns emerge, and those patterns reveal as much about medieval society as they do about religious life. By the time we're finished tonight, you'll understand why medieval chronicles are filled with attempts to reform convent life, why church councils repeatedly issued decrees about proper monastic behavior, and why the phrase "taking the veil" carried implications far beyond simple religious devotion. You'll also discover why some of the period's most powerful women chose the convent not as a retreat from the world, but as their best chance to influence it. This isn't a story of good nuns versus bad nuns. That kind of moral binary misses the point entirely. Instead, it's about human beings trying to navigate impossible expectations within institutions that were simultaneously expected to be otherworldly and utterly practical. It's about women who found ways to exercise agency in a world that offered them precious few options, sometimes through genuine piety, sometimes through clever manipulation, and sometimes through outright rebellion. So settle in as we explore the hidden corridors of medieval convent life, where prayer books shared shelf space with account ledgers, where abbesses wielded power that made kings nervous, and where the pursuit of holiness sometimes took very unholy detours. Tonight, we're not just talking about medieval nuns. We're talking about power, gender, spirituality, and human nature itself, all wrapped up in habits and hidden behind cloister walls. Let's be honest, when Hollywood wants to depict medieval nuns, they either go full gothic horror or saintly martyrdom, with very little middle ground. The reality, as usual, was far more interesting and infinitely more human. Medieval convents weren't spiritual utopias or dens of corruption. They were complex communities where real women lived real lives, complete with all the petty jealousies, ambitious schemes, and genuine friendships that make human society. What it is done to understand medieval convent life, you first need to grasp what these institutions actually were. Think of them as a cross between a boarding school, a business corporation, and a small town, all wrapped in religious ceremony. The typical convent housed anywhere from a dozen to several hundred women, ranging from teenage novices to elderly dowagers, each bringing their own social background, personal agenda, and level of religious commitment to the mix. That's right, not everyone who took the veil did so out of overwhelming spiritual devotion. In fact, medieval convents served multiple social functions that had precious little to do with mystical rapture. For noble families, convents provided a respectable parking space for daughters they couldn't afford to marry off with appropriate dowries. Sound familiar? It should. The medieval marriage market was brutal, and convents offered a socially acceptable alternative to spinsterhood or disadvantageous matches. Meanwhile, for middle-class families, convents represented upward social mobility. A merchant's daughter might never marry into nobility, but she could certainly become an abbess and wield more practical power than most noble wives ever dreamed of. By the 13th century, some abbesses controlled territories larger than many kingdoms, commanded their own armies, and answered directly to the Pope rather than local bishops. Of course, this meant that convent politics could be absolutely vicious. When you've got ambitious women competing for positions of real power within a closed community, things get interesting fast. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of abbesses being accused of everything from financial impropriety to outright witchcraft by their rivals. Elections for abbess positions sometimes required armed intervention to prevent actual riots. Let's talk about the daily routine that supposedly governed convent life. The rule of Saint Benedict, which most communities followed, prescribed a rigid schedule of prayers, meals, work, and sleep designed to eliminate worldly distractions and focus the mind on spiritual matters. Lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce, sext, and none throughout the day, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. A schedule that left little room for personal time or private thoughts. If you thought this sounds exhausting, you'd be right. And if you're wondering whether medieval nuns actually stuck to this schedule religiously, well, let's just say that medieval bishops spent an awful lot of time writing stern letters about lax observance of the canonical hours. By the 14th century, many convents had evolved more flexible interpretations of traditional rules, particularly regarding the frequency and duration of prayer services. Still, the physical structure of convent life was designed to reinforce spiritual discipline. High walls separated the nuns from the outside world, creating what was supposed to be a sacred space removed from worldly temptations. The cloister, that central courtyard around which most convent buildings were arranged, symbolized the enclosed garden of spiritual perfection where souls could bloom without contamination from secular influences. And yet, these walls were far more porous than idealists like to admit. Medieval convents weren't hermetically sealed communities. They needed to conduct business with the outside world, receive supplies, manage their estates, and maintain relationships with powerful patrons. This meant a constant flow of visitors, messengers, tradespeople, and various hangers-on who brought News, gossip, and sometimes more intimate connections from beyond the cloister walls. To be fair, many convents genuinely tried to maintain strict standards of enclosure. Some communities developed elaborate systems of grills, speaking wheels, and intermediary chambers designed to allow necessary contact with outsiders while preserving the nun separation from the world. But human nature has a way of finding creative solutions to institutional restrictions, and medieval nuns were nothing if not creative. The clothing regulations tell their own story about the gap between ideal and reality. Nuns were supposed to dress simply and uniformly, their habits marking their rejection of worldly vanity and their embrace of holy poverty. Meanwhile, medieval bishops' visitation records are filled with complaints about nuns wearing silk undergarments, elaborate headdresses, fashionable shoes, and jewelry hidden beneath their supposedly plain habits. Some convents developed reputations for their nuns, worldly sophistication that attracted fashionable visitors from across Europe. The Abbey of Fontevraud in France became famous for its cultured abbesses who corresponded with troubadours and patronized artists. Of course, this kind of intellectual and cultural flowering was exactly what reformers found most troubling. Too much learning and artistic appreciation, they argued, distracted from proper spiritual focus. By the later medieval period, many convents had evolved into something resembling exclusive clubs for aristocratic women. Members brought their own servants, maintained private apartments, and enjoyed standards of living that would have been luxurious by contemporary standards. The Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain, for example, housed nuns who each controlled their own household staff and managed substantial personal incomes. This isn't to say that medieval convent life was uniformly comfortable or worldly. Many communities maintained strict standards throughout the period, and even in more relaxed houses, the basic constraints of communal living, religious obligations, and institutional hierarchy created real limitations on individual freedom. Still, for women in a society that offered few alternatives, convents could provide opportunities for education, administrative experience, and even a kind of independence that marriage rarely offered. The contradiction inherent in medieval convent life. Institutions supposedly devoted to otherworldly concerns that inevitably became deeply involved in very worldly affairs, reflects broader tensions in medieval Christianity itself. These communities were expected to model perfect Christian living while simultaneously functioning as practical social institutions. And that fundamental contradiction shaped everything from their daily routines to their greatest scandals. If you thought medieval politics were complicated, wait until you dive into the Byzantine power structures that governed convent life. Let's be clear about something that often gets lost in romanticized histories. Medieval abbesses weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political powerhouses who could make or break kingdoms. And they knew it. The medieval church hierarchy placed abbesses in a unique position that would make modern corporate executives envious. A powerful abbess reported directly to the Pope, bypassing local bishops who might have their own agendas. This meant that in practical terms, the abbess of Fontevraud wielded more actual authority than most dukes, and she had the papal bulls to prove it. That's right. These women controlled vast territories, commanded military forces, and negotiated treaties with foreign powers, all while supposedly being dead to the world. Meanwhile, the appointment process for these positions was a masterclass in medieval political maneuvering. Technically, abbesses were elected by their communities, but in practice, the process involved a complex web of noble patronage, papal politics, and occasionally outright bribery that would make modern lobbyists blush. Powerful families viewed abbess positions as crucial stepping stones in their political strategies, leading to election campaigns that sometimes involved everything from promises of substantial donations to actual military threats. Sound familiar? It should. The same dynamics that governed secular politics inevitably infected religious institutions, despite everyone's best intentions. By the 13th century, some abbey elections required papal intervention to prevent actual warfare between competing factions. The Abbey of Quedlinburg in Germany became notorious for election disputes that dragged on for years and required imperial intervention to resolve. To be fair, this political involvement wasn't entirely the result of worldly corruption. Medieval society was deeply integrated. There was no meaningful separation between religious and secular authority, and expecting religious institutions to remain above politics was like expecting water to flow uphill. Abbesses inherited responsibilities that automatically made them political players, whether they wanted to be or not. Let's talk about the actual scope of abbatial power, because it's genuinely staggering. The Abbess of Las Huelgas in Spain controlled 13 towns, could appoint parish priests throughout her territory, and had the right to hear confessions, a privilege usually reserved for ordained clergy. She wore episcopal rings and carried a staff of office, and when she died, her funeral included all the ceremonies typically reserved for bishops. Of course, this level of authority inevitably led to conflicts with male church hierarchy who found it uncomfortable to acknowledge women exercising quasi-episcopal powers. The theological gymnastics required to justify female spiritual authority while maintaining official doctrine about women's subordinate status created endless opportunities for political maneuvering and jurisdictional disputes. By the 12th century, some abbesses had developed sophisticated administrative systems that rivaled royal chancelleries. The Abbey of Fontevraud maintained diplomatic correspondence with rulers across Europe, operated an extensive network of daughter houses, and managed financial portfolios that included everything from agricultural estates to urban real estate ventures. If you thought medieval women were excluded from business and politics, think again. They just did it from behind convent walls. Still, the most fascinating aspect of abbatial power was how these women navigated the contradiction between their supposed otherworldliness and their very worldly responsibilities. Successful abbesses developed a kind of spiritual political double consciousness that allowed them to invoke religious authority when it served their purposes, while engaging in hard-headed political calculation when necessary. And yet, this balancing act was precarious and constantly under scrutiny. Male church authorities regularly attempted to curtail abbatial privileges, arguing that too much temporal power distracted from spiritual duties. The ongoing tension between reformist pressure and practical necessity created a dynamic political environment where abbesses had to constantly defend their prerogatives while appearing to embrace holy humility. The relationship between abbesses and their royal patrons reveals another layer of this complex power structure. Queens and noble ladies often retained close ties to convents they had founded or patronized, creating informal networks of female influence that paralleled and sometimes challenged official male power structures. Eleanor of Aquitaine's relationship with Fontevraud, for example, gave her a power base that survived multiple political upheavals and provided sanctuary when her marriage to Henry II became untenable. Meanwhile, the papal politics surrounding convent governance became increasingly complex as the medieval period progressed. Different popes took varying approaches to female religious authority, with some expanding abbatial privileges while others attempted to restrict them. These shifting policies created opportunities for savvy abbesses to play different levels of church hierarchy against each other in pursuit of their institutional goals. By the 14th century, some convents had developed such extensive political networks that they functioned almost as independent states. The Abbey of Quedlinburg controlled territory throughout the Holy Roman Empire, maintained its own diplomatic corps, and even minted its own currency. The abbess held the rank of princess of the empire and sat in the imperial diet alongside secular Rulers. Of course, this level of political involvement inevitably attracted criticism from reformers who argued that such worldly engagement contradicted monastic ideals. The tension between spiritual calling and practical necessity became a constant source of controversy, with different communities finding different ways to reconcile these competing demands. The financial aspects of abbatial power were particularly complex and often controversial. Abbesses controlled enormous wealth. The Abbey of Fontevraud's revenues in the 13th century exceeded those of most European kingdoms, but they were theoretically committed to personal poverty. This led to creative accounting practices and elaborate theological justifications that would impress modern tax lawyers. Still, it's important to recognize that these political abbesses weren't simply medieval Margaret Thatcher's in habits. Many combined genuine spiritual devotion with political acumen, seeing their temporal responsibilities as expressions of their religious calling rather than distractions from it. The best abbesses managed to be both effective administrators and inspiring spiritual leaders, proving that the medieval world's arbitrary divisions between sacred and secular were more theoretical than practical. Let's be honest about something that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable. Medieval spirituality was thoroughly entangled with economic calculation in ways that would make contemporary megachurch pastors seem positively ascetic. Medieval convents weren't just spiritual communities. They were economic engines that controlled vast wealth while supposedly embracing holy poverty. And the contradictions inherent in this arrangement created some genuinely spectacular financial scandals. To understand the economic reality of medieval convent life, you need to grasp the basic funding model that kept these institutions operating. Most convents were established by wealthy patrons who provided initial endowments of land, money, and privileges, then expected ongoing influence over institutional policies in return for continued support. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same patron-client relationship that governed most medieval institutions, with the added twist of spiritual services being part of the transaction. That's right. Medieval convents operated sophisticated spiritual service economies that would make modern prosperity gospel preachers envious. Wealthy patrons didn't just donate money out of pure altruism. They were purchasing specific spiritual services: prayers for the dead, masses for souls in purgatory, intercession with saints, and the accumulated spiritual merit of the monastic community. All of this was available for the right price, and abbesses became expert at packaging and marketing their community's spiritual assets. Meanwhile, the actual mechanics of convent finance were mind-bogglingly complex. A typical abbey controlled multiple revenue streams. Agricultural estates worked by tenant farmers, urban properties generating rental income, mills and other industrial facilities, trading ventures, and various feudal privileges that generated fees and taxes. By the 13th century, major abbeys employed professional administrators, maintained sophisticated accounting systems, and engaged in financial practices that anticipated modern corporate structures. Of course, this created immediate theological problems. How do you reconcile vast institutional wealth with vows of personal poverty? Medieval theologians developed elaborate justifications distinguishing between personal ownership and institutional stewardship. But the practical reality was that abbesses lived like queens while technically owning nothing. The semantic gymnastics required to maintain this fiction became increasingly elaborate as convent wealth grew. Let's talk about some specific examples, because the scale of convent wealth was genuinely staggering. The Abbey of Fontevraud controlled estates across multiple kingdoms, maintained diplomatic immunity, and generated revenues that exceeded most royal treasuries. The abbess traveled with an entourage that included armed guards, personal chaplains, and administrative staff that rivaled royal households in size and sophistication. If you thought medieval nuns lived simple, Austere lives. Think again. Visitation. Records from the 14th century describe convent facilities that included private apartments with fireplaces, elaborate gardens, libraries, and guest quarters that accommodated royal visitors in appropriate luxury. Some convents maintained their own musicians, artists, and scholars, creating cultural environments that attracted intellectuals from across Europe. Still, the most fascinating aspect of convent economics was how these institutions manipulated the medieval economy's spiritual dimensions for practical advantage. Abbesses became expert at leveraging their community's reputation for holiness into concrete financial benefits. A convent known for particularly effective prayers could charge premium prices for spiritual services, while communities with famous mystics or miracle workers could attract pilgrims whose donations supplemented regular revenues. And yet, this spiritual commercialization created constant tension between economic necessity and religious ideals. Reform movements regularly emerged within monastic communities, calling for return to authentic poverty and spiritual focus. But these reforms invariably foundered on practical realities. You can't maintain elaborate religious institutions without money, and medieval convents had evolved into social services that their communities couldn't afford to lose. To be fair, convent wealth served important social functions beyond maintaining comfortable lifestyles for aristocratic nuns. Medieval abbeys operated hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions that provided crucial services to local populations. They also served as banks, offering loans and financial services in an economy that lacked modern financial institutions. The economic infrastructure that supported these social services required sophisticated management and substantial capital investment. By the later medieval period, some convents had evolved into what we might recognize as early corporations, with diversified revenue portfolios, professional management structures, and strategic planning processes. The Abbey of Las Huodas operated textile manufacturing facilities, agricultural processing centers, and trading networks that extended across the Mediterranean. The abbess functioned essentially as a CEO managing a complex business empire, while maintaining the fiction of spiritual otherworldliness. Meanwhile, the accounting practices developed by medieval convents anticipated modern corporate financial management in surprising ways. Double-entry bookkeeping, cost-benefit analysis, and strategic resource allocation. All of these techniques were refined in monastery scriptoriums before they became standard business practices. Medieval abbesses were among Europe's most sophisticated financial managers, even though they were supposedly dead to worldly concerns. Of course, this level of financial sophistication inevitably led to creative accounting practices that would impress modern tax evaders. Medieval chronicles are filled with accusations of abbesses embezzling funds, manipulating property records, and engaging in financial fraud that would make contemporary corporate scandals seem quaint. The temptation to skim from institutional revenues for personal use proved irresistible to many abbesses who lived like queens while technically owning nothing. The relationship between individual poverty and institutional wealth created endless opportunities for rationalization and abuse. Abbesses who maintained personal poverty while controlling vast institutional resources could justify almost any expenditure as serving the community's spiritual mission. Private apartments became necessary for effective administration. Elaborate. Clothing represented institutional dignity, and expensive travel was required for proper oversight of far-flung properties. Still, it's important to recognize that many medieval abbesses genuinely struggled with these contradictions and attempted to find authentic ways to reconcile spiritual calling with practical responsibility. The best monastic administrators managed to be both effective stewards of institutional resources and genuine spiritual leaders, proving that the medieval world's integration of sacred and secular concerns could produce admirable results as well. as spectacular corruption. The ultimate irony of medieval convent economics was that institutions founded to model rejection of worldly values became some of the period's most successful economic enterprises. This wasn't simply hypocrisy. It reflected deeper tensions in medieval Christianity between otherworldly ideals and practical social needs that continue to challenge religious institutions today. Let's be clear about something that medieval chroniclers preferred to whisper about in Latin. Convent walls were supposed to protect nuns from worldly temptation, but human sexuality has a way of finding creative outlets regardless of institutional restrictions. Medieval convents weren't immune to romantic entanglements, sexual experimentation, and passionate affairs that would make modern reality. TV producers weep with envy. If you thought taking vows of chastity automatically eliminated sexual desire, you clearly haven't spent much time around actual human beings. Medieval nuns were women with all the emotional and physical needs that entails, and the artificial constraints of monastic life often intensified rather than diminished these natural impulses. The result was a complex underground economy of romantic relationships, sexual liaisons, and emotional entanglements that flourished despite official prohibition. That's right, medieval chronicles are absolutely packed with accounts of nuns engaging in behaviors that would have shocked their contemporary audiences if anyone had been brave enough to discuss such matters openly. But historians have access to visitation records, episcopal complaints, and reform documents that reveal the gap between monastic ideals and human reality in sometimes startling detail. To understand the sexual culture of medieval convents, you need to grasp the social context that shaped these institutions. Most nuns entered religious life as teenagers or young adults, often before they'd had opportunities to explore romantic relationships or sexual identity. Confining sexually inexperienced young women in closed communities and expecting them to maintain perfect chastity for decades was, frankly, a recipe for creative rule-bending. Meanwhile, the homosocial environment of convent life created intimate relationships between women that sometimes crossed boundaries that made church authorities deeply uncomfortable. Medieval theologians hadn't developed sophisticated concepts of homosexuality as we understand it today, but they certainly recognized that intense female friendships could involve spiritual dangers that required careful supervision. Sound familiar? It should. The same dynamics that create romantic drama in any closed community applied to medieval convents, with the added complications of religious vows and ecclesiastical oversight. Episcopal visitation records from the 14th century describe convents where particular friendships had evolved into exclusive relationships that disrupted community harmony and created factions based on romantic alliances. Of course, the most scandalous affairs involved relationships with men from outside the convent community. Despite elaborate precautions designed to limit contact between nuns and male visitors, romantic connections inevitably developed through correspondence, brief encounters during business transactions, and sometimes more sustained relationships with regular visitors like chaplains, confessors, and administrative staff. Let's talk about some specific cases, because medieval chronicles preserved accounts that are simultaneously shocking and entirely predictable. The Abbey of Sant Pere de les Puels in Barcelona became notorious in the 13th century for a series of scandals involving nuns who maintained romantic relationships with local nobility, sometimes resulting in pregnancies that required creative theological explanations. Still, the most common sexual relationships within medieval convents were between the nuns themselves. The intense emotional bonds that developed in closed female communities sometimes evolved into physically intimate relationships that challenged official doctrines about proper religious behavior. Medieval reformers spent enormous energy developing rules about sleeping arrangements, private conversations, and exclusive friendships that reveal their deep anxiety about lesbian relationships. And yet, distinguishing between intense spiritual friendship and physical intimacy isn't always possible. From historical records, medieval women expressed emotional connection in ways that can seem romantically charged to modern readers, and the line between acceptable spiritual intimacy and forbidden sexual behavior was often unclear, even to contemporary observers. To be fair, many nuns successfully maintained their vows of chastity throughout long religious careers, finding fulfillment in spiritual devotion and community service that made sexual relationships unnecessary or undesirable. But even in the most disciplined communities, the artificial constraints of monastic life created emotional pressures that sometimes erupted in dramatic fashion. By the later medieval period, some convents had developed reputations for sexual laxity that attracted satirical attention from contemporary writers. Geoffrey Chaucer's prioress represents a literary type that audiences immediately recognized: the worldly nun whose religious devotion was secondary to personal pleasure and social advancement. Meanwhile, the theological implications of sexual behavior within religious communities created complex problems for church authorities. How you discipline nuns who've taken irrevocable vows but violated fundamental aspects of religious life? Medieval bishops developed elaborate systems of penance, transfer between communities, and sometimes imprisonment that attempted to address sexual misconduct while preserving institutional stability. If you thought medieval people were more repressed about sexuality than modern audiences, you'd be partly right. But their repression took forms that sometimes created more intense sexual expression rather than less. The forbidden nature of romantic relationships within convents seems to have made them more rather than less appealing to women who found conventional marriage unattractive. Of course, the most dramatic sexual scandals involved pregnancies that couldn't be hidden or explained away. Medieval chronicles describe cases where nuns gave birth to children whose paternity created political crises, diplomatic incidents, and theological controversies that required papal intervention to resolve. These weren't isolated incidents. They were predictable results of institutional arrangements that ignored basic human nature. The relationship between mystical spirituality and sexual expression was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Some nuns channeled sexual energy into intense spiritual experiences that bordered on the erotic, while others found that spiritual ecstasy awakened physical desires that demanded satisfaction through more conventional means. Still, it's important to recognize that not all romantic relationships within medieval convents were secretive or guilt-ridden. Some communities developed cultures that tolerated or even celebrated intense emotional bonds between women, treating exclusive friendships as spiritually beneficial rather than problematic. These relationships could provide emotional support and intellectual companionship that enriched rather than threatened religious life. The ultimate irony of sexual regulation within medieval convents was that institutions designed to eliminate worldly temptation often created more intense and complex sexual cultures than existed in secular society. The artificial constraints of monastic life, combined with the natural human need for emotional and physical connection, produced romantic drama that was simultaneously predictable and shocking to contemporary observers. Let's be honest about it. Something that makes traditional church history deeply uncomfortable. Some of the most radical religious thinkers in medieval Europe were nuns who used the supposed safety of convent walls to develop theological ideas that would have gotten them burned at the stake if they'd been expressed by secular women. Medieval convents weren't just centers of orthodox piety. They were hotbeds of religious innovation, mystical experimentation, and sometimes outright heretical thinking. If you thought medieval nuns were uniformly submissive and obedient, you clearly haven't encountered figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who spent decades locked in theological combat with bishops, abbots, and even popes who tried to restrict her visionary activities. That's right. This 12th century abbess claimed direct revelation from God, composed complex theological treatises, conducted scientific research, and generally behaved like she had a hotline to the divine that bypassed all earthly authority. Meanwhile, the protected status of religious women created unique opportunities for intellectual and spiritual exploration that secular women couldn't access. A nun could claim mystical visions that challenged orthodox doctrine, develop radical theological interpretations, and even criticize male church hierarchy, all under the protective umbrella of religious authority that made direct persecution more difficult. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, oppressed groups have used whatever institutional protections they could find to develop and express radical ideas. And medieval convents served exactly this function for women who refused to accept conventional limitations on female spiritual authority. To understand the revolutionary potential of medieval convent culture, you need to grasp how mystical spirituality could become a form of religious rebellion. When a nun claimed direct communication with God, she was implicitly asserting spiritual authority that transcended normal ecclesiastical hierarchies. If God spoke directly to women, what did that say about male claims to exclusive religious leadership? Of course, church authorities recognized this threat and developed elaborate systems for evaluating and controlling mystical claims. The process of discerning authentic visions from heretical delusions became a major preoccupation of medieval theologians. But the criteria they developed were inherently subjective and politically influenced. Mystical nuns who supported orthodox positions were more likely to be recognized as saints, while those who challenged established authority were more likely to be condemned as heretics. Let's talk about some specific examples, because medieval chronicles preserved accounts of religious rebellion that are genuinely shocking in their boldness. Marguerite Porete, a 14th century mystic, developed theological ideas about the soul's direct relationship with God that eliminated the need for church mediation entirely. When church authorities condemned her writings, she refused to recant, and was eventually burned at the stake for heresy. Still, the most common form of religious rebellion among medieval nuns was more subtle but equally significant. Many communities developed interpretations of monastic rules that prioritize personal spiritual experience over institutional obedience, creating cultures of religious individualism that challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority. And yet, the line between orthodox mysticism and heretical thinking was often impossibly thin. The same visionary experiences that could lead to sainthood could also result in condemnation for heresy, depending largely on political circumstances and institutional relationships that had little to do with theological substance. By the later medieval period, some convents had become centers of religious movements that challenged core assumptions of medieval Christianity. The Beguines, semi-monastic communities of women who took no formal vows but lived religiously, developed theological ideas about spiritual perfection that influenced mainstream mysticism while remaining technically outside church control. Meanwhile, the intellectual culture that flourished in some medieval convents produced scholarly work that rivaled anything produced in male monastic communities. Nuns wrote theological treatises, composed music, conducted scientific research, and developed philosophical systems that demonstrated intellectual capabilities that official church doctrine claimed women didn't possess. If you thought medieval women were excluded from serious intellectual work, think again. They just did it from behind convent walls where male authorities found it harder to suppress. Roswitha of Gandersheim wrote plays that adapted classical Roman comedy for Christian audiences, while Herod of Landsberg created encyclopedic works that preserved and transmitted classical learning through the medieval period. To be fair, most religious rebellion within medieval convents was more practical than theological. Nuns found creative ways to circumvent restrictions on their movement, communication, and personal autonomy without directly challenging church doctrine. These small acts of defiance, maintaining correspondence with male friends, hosting elaborate entertainments, traveling without proper authorization, represented forms of resistance that preserved individual agency within restrictive institutional frameworks. Of course, the most dramatic forms of religious rebellion involved direct confrontation with male church hierarchy. Some abbesses refused episcopal visitations, rejected unwanted reforms, and maintained institutional independence that challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority. These conflicts sometimes required papal intervention to resolve and created precedents that influenced broader discussions about religious authority. The relationship between mystical spirituality and social criticism was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Nuns who claimed prophetic visions often used their supposed divine inspiration to critique social inequality, political corruption, and ecclesiastical abuse in ways that would have been dangerous for secular critics to attempt. Still, it's important to recognize that religious rebellion among medieval nuns operated within constraints that limited its ultimate impact. Even the most radical mystical claims had to be expressed in theological language that preserved at least nominal orthodoxy, and direct challenges to male authority risked severe punishment that few nuns were prepared to accept. And yet, the cumulative impact of centuries of female religious innovation was significant. Medieval convents preserved and developed intellectual traditions, mystical practices, and theological insights that influenced broader Christian culture in ways that male church authorities couldn't completely control or suppress. By the 15th century, some convents had become centers of reform movements that anticipated Protestant criticisms of Catholic institutional corruption. These communities developed ideas about personal spirituality, direct relationship with God, and reduced emphasis on clerical mediation that would become central themes in later religious revolutions. The ultimate significance of religious rebellion within medieval convents wasn't its immediate impact. Most challenges to orthodox authority were successfully suppressed, but its long-term influence on Christian thought and practice. Women who used whatever intellectual freedom they could find to explore radical religious ideas created theological resources that would eventually transform European spirituality in ways they never could have imagined. Let's be clear about something that sanitized religious histories prefer to ignore. Medieval convents contained the full spectrum of human behavior, from genuinely saintly devotion to spectacular moral failure, often within the same community and sometimes within the same individual. The gap between spiritual ideals and human reality created a fascinating range of characters who defy easy categorization as either holy women or fallen sisters. That's right, medieval nuns weren't uniform in their spiritual commitment, moral behavior, or intellectual capacity any more than any other group of human beings. Some achieved genuine sanctity that inspired centuries of devotion, while others engaged in behaviors that would embarrass modern reality TV stars. Most, predictably, fell somewhere between these extremes, trying to navigate the impossible demands of monastic life with varying degrees of success. To understand this spectrum of behavior, you need to grasp the diverse motivations that brought women to convent life in the first place. Some genuinely felt called to religious devotion and found in monastic community the spiritual fulfillment they sought. Others were essentially dumped in convents by families who couldn't or wouldn't provide marriage dowries. Still others saw religious life as their best opportunity for education, independence, or social advancement that secular society denied them sound familiar. It should, when you force diverse groups of people with different motivations into the same institutional framework. You get exactly the kind of behavioral variation that medieval chronicles describe. The amazing thing isn't that some nuns failed to live up to monastic ideals, but that so many managed to find meaningful ways to live within such restrictive circumstances. Meanwhile, the saints who emerged from medieval convent culture represent some of the most remarkable spiritual achievements in Christian history. Hildegard of Bingen combined mystical visions with scientific research, musical composition, and political activism that influenced European culture for centuries. Julian of Norwich developed theological insights about divine love that anticipated modern spiritual psychology. Catherine of Siena used her mystical authority to intervene in papal politics and international diplomacy with stunning effectiveness. If you thought medieval female sanctity was passive and submissive, think again. These women used their spiritual reputations to exercise influence that would have been impossible through conventional channels. They corresponded with popes and emperors, founded religious movements, and developed theological ideas that shaped Christian thought in ways that are still being discovered by modern scholars. Of course, the process of medieval saint-making was deeply political and reflected broader power dynamics within church hierarchy. Women who supported orthodox positions and worked within established institutional frameworks were more likely to achieve official recognition, while those who challenged authority or developed uncomfortable theological innovations often remained unrecognized despite genuine spiritual achievements. Let's talk about the sinners, because medieval chronicles preserved accounts of monastic behavior that would shock contemporary audiences. The visitation of English nunneries conducted in the early 16th century documented convents where nuns maintained private households with personal servants, engaged in commercial enterprises for personal profit, and hosted elaborate entertainments that attracted fashionable secular society. Still, it's important to distinguish between different types of sinful behavior among medieval nuns. Some violations of monastic rules reflected genuine moral failure: embezzlement, sexual misconduct, abandonment of religious duties. Others represented reasonable human responses to unreasonable institutional demands, maintaining family relationships, pursuing intellectual interests, seeking emotional companionship that monastic life was supposed to eliminate. And yet, the most interesting cases involve nuns who combined genuine spiritual devotion with behaviors that violated technical monastic rules. Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote mystical poetry that revealed intimate spiritual experiences while maintaining relationships with male spiritual advisors that scandalized conservative observers. Her work demonstrates that authentic spirituality and institutional conformity weren't necessarily synonymous. To be fair, medieval standards for evaluating religious behavior were often impossibly rigid and reflected theological assumptions that modern people find problematic. The obsession with sexual purity, for example, led to condemnation of relationships that modern observers might consider psychologically healthy and spiritually beneficial. By the later medieval period, some convents had developed cultures that openly acknowledged the gap between monastic ideals and human reality. These communities found ways to accommodate individual needs and preferences while maintaining enough institutional structure to preserve their religious identity. The result was a kind of practical monasticism that prioritized community harmony over strict rule observance. Meanwhile, the relationship between personal sanctity and institutional success was often inverse rather than direct. Some of the most spiritually advanced nuns were terrible administrators who couldn't manage practical affairs, while some of the most effective abbesses were primarily politicians who used religious language to pursue secular goals. If you thought spiritual and temporal concerns were neatly separated in medieval religious life, you'd be wrong. The most successful religious leaders learned to integrate these different aspects of human experience in ways that served both spiritual and practical needs. This integration often required compromises that purist reformers found troubling, but that reflected mature understanding of human nature. Of course, the spectrum of nun behavior also reflected broader social changes that transformed medieval European culture. As urbanization increased commercial opportunities, as literacy spread intellectual possibilities, and as political structures evolved new forms of authority, convent life adapted to accommodate these changes in ways that sometimes conflicted with traditional monastic ideals. The economic pressures that forced many convents to become more worldly also created opportunities for spiritual innovation that might not have emerged in more isolated communities. Nuns who engaged with secular society brought back ideas, perspectives, and challenges that enriched religious life, even when they violated technical rules about monastic enclosure. Still, the ultimate measure of medieval nun behavior shouldn't be conformity to institutional rules that were often arbitrary and sometimes counterproductive. Many nuns who violated technical monastic regulations achieved authentic spiritual growth and made genuine contributions to their communities and broader society. The variety of responses to monastic life among medieval nuns reflects the diversity of human personality and circumstance that institutional frameworks can channel but never completely control. Some women thrived within traditional structures. Others found creative ways to modify those structures to meet their needs. And still others used religious life as a platform for activities that had little to do with conventional spirituality. By the end of the medieval period, the spectrum of nun behavior had expanded to include almost every conceivable variation of human response to religious life. This diversity wasn't a sign of institutional failure, but rather evidence of the adaptability and resilience that allowed medieval convents to survive and sometimes flourish despite impossible contradictions between spiritual ideals and practical necessities. Let's be honest about something that traditional educational histories consistently underestimate. Medieval convents were among Europe's most important centers of learning, artistic creation, and intellectual innovation, often precisely because they provided women with educational opportunities that secular society denied them. If you thought the medieval period was an intellectual wasteland for women, you clearly haven't spent time exploring the remarkable achievements that emerged from behind convent walls. That's right, while secular women were generally excluded from formal education, university training, and scholarly careers, nuns had access to libraries, writing materials, and intellectual community that made sophisticated learning possible. The result was a flowering of female creativity that produced everything from illuminated manuscripts to musical compositions to scientific treatises that rival anything produced by their male contemporaries. To understand the intellectual culture of medieval convents, you need to grasp how religious life accidentally created the most comprehensive educational system available to medieval women. Nuns needed to read Latin to participate in religious services, understand theological concepts to engage in spiritual practice, and develop administrative skills to manage complex institutions. These practical requirements created educational opportunities that often expanded far beyond their original religious purposes. Meanwhile, the preservation and copying of manuscripts, one of the primary economic activities of medieval monasteries, gave nuns access to the entire intellectual heritage of classical and Christian civilization. A nun working in a scriptorium might spend years copying works by Aristotle, Augustine, Ovid, and contemporary theologians, absorbing ideas and perspectives that shaped her own intellectual development in ways that monastic authorities never intended. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, Supposedly practical education has had a way of expanding into broader intellectual exploration, and medieval convents demonstrate this pattern perfectly. Women who entered religious life to escape secular limitations often found themselves with access to learning opportunities that exceeded anything available to most men, of course. This intellectual freedom operated within constraints that reflected medieval assumptions about appropriate female learning. Nuns were supposed to focus on devotional reading, practical skills, and spiritual development rather than the abstract theological speculation or philosophical inquiry that dominated male scholarly culture. But the line between appropriate and inappropriate learning was often unclear, creating opportunities for intellectual exploration that creative nuns exploited enthusiastically. Let's talk about some specific achievements, because the scope of intellectual work produced by medieval nuns is genuinely stunning. Roswitha of Gandersheim wrote plays that adapted classical Roman comedy for Christian audiences, demonstrating mastery of Latin literature and dramatic technique that rivaled contemporary male scholars. Her work shows sophisticated understanding of classical literary forms and creative ability to transform pagan material for Christian purposes. Still, the most remarkable aspect of medieval convent intellectual culture was how it combined scholarly learning with artistic creativity in ways that produced genuinely original cultural contributions. Hildegard of Bingen composed music that pushed the boundaries of contemporary musical theory, wrote scientific treatises that combined empirical observation with mystical insight, and created illuminated manuscripts that integrated artistic and intellectual elements in revolutionary ways. And yet, this creative achievement often required careful navigation of theological boundaries that could be crossed only at considerable risk. Medieval church authorities were suspicious of intellectual innovation, particularly when it came from women who were supposed to focus on spiritual submission rather than creative self-expression. Successful nun scholars learned to present their work in ways that emphasize religious devotion while pursuing intellectual goals that were often quite secular. By the 12th century, some convents had developed educational programs that rivaled cathedral schools in their sophistication and comprehensiveness. The Abbey of Fontevraud maintained a library that attracted scholars from across Europe and operated schools that educated not only nuns, but also secular women from aristocratic families. These institutions created intellectual communities that fostered learning and creativity in ways that influenced broader European culture. Meanwhile, the artistic achievements of medieval nuns often reflected access to resources and patronage that allowed for creative expression on a scale that would have been impossible for secular women. Convent scriptoriums produced illuminated manuscripts that demonstrated technical mastery and artistic innovation that influenced the development of medieval art. These works often combined religious themes with aesthetic sensibilities that reflected sophisticated artistic training and creative vision. If you thought medieval art was uniformly anonymous and impersonal, you need to reconsider the signed works produced by medieval nuns who took pride in their artistic achievements and wanted recognition for their creative contributions. And a 10th century Spanish nun signed her illuminated manuscripts and included self-portraits that demonstrate artistic self-consciousness that challenges stereotypes about medieval artistic production. To be fair, the intellectual culture of medieval convents was shaped by the same social hierarchies that governed secular society. Aristocratic nuns had access to better education and more sophisticated cultural resources than their lower-class sisters. And this inequality influenced both the quantity and quality of intellectual work produced within religious communities. Of course, the tension between intellectual achievement and religious humility created complex psychological pressures for learned nuns, who were supposed to embrace spiritual submission while pursuing scholarly excellence. Many resolved this contradiction by presenting their learning as divine gift rather than personal achievement, attributing their insights to mystical revelation rather than intellectual effort. The relationship between mystical spirituality and intellectual creativity was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Some nuns channeled scholarly energy into mystical writing that combined theological sophistication with poetic expression, creating works that were simultaneously devotional and literary. Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love demonstrates theological insights that reflect deep learning presented through mystical narrative that obscures but doesn't eliminate its intellectual foundations. Still, the most significant long-term impact of medieval convent intellectual culture was its preservation and transmission of classical learning through periods when male monastic communities were often more focused on practical concerns than scholarly pursuits. Nuns copied and preserved texts that might otherwise have been lost, maintaining intellectual traditions that influenced later cultural developments in ways that are still being discovered. And yet, this preservative function was often accompanied by creative adaptation that transformed classical material in innovative ways. Medieval nuns didn't simply copy ancient texts. They translated, summarized, commented upon, and adapted classical works for contemporary audiences, creating new forms of literary and intellectual expression that reflected their unique perspectives. As educated women in a male-dominated culture dot by the later medieval period, some convents had become centers of humanistic learning that anticipated Renaissance educational ideals. These communities emphasized classical languages, literary study, and artistic training that prepared women for cultural leadership roles that secular society was beginning to make available to educated females. The ultimate significance of intellectual achievement within medieval convents wasn't just its immediate cultural impact, but its demonstration that women could excel in scholarly and artistic pursuits when given access to appropriate resources and educational opportunities. This lesson would eventually influence broader social attitudes about female education and creative capacity in ways that transformed European culture. Let's be clear about something that makes both Catholic apologists and anti-clerical critics uncomfortable. The constant stream of reform movements targeting medieval convents wasn't evidence of uniform corruption, but rather proof of an ongoing struggle between spiritual ideals and human reality that produced both genuine renewal and predictable resistance in roughly equal measure. If you thought medieval religious reform was a straightforward process of correcting obvious abuses, you clearly haven't examined the complex politics surrounding monastic renewal movements. That's right. Every attempt to reform convent life involved competing visions of authentic religious practice, conflicting interests among different social groups, and power struggles that often had more to do with institutional control than spiritual purification. To understand the reform dynamics that shaped medieval convent culture, you need to grasp how different groups had different stakes in maintaining or changing existing religious practices. Church hierarchy wanted increased clerical control over female religious communities. Secular patrons wanted continued influence over institutions they'd funded. Individual nuns wanted to preserve whatever autonomy and comfort they'd achieved within existing systems. These competing interests made reform an inherently political process, regardless of spiritual motivations. Meanwhile, the theological justifications for reform often masked practical concerns that had little to do with religious purity. Male church authorities who complained about nuns maintaining too much independence were often more concerned about ecclesiastical jurisdiction than spiritual welfare. Secular rulers who supported reform movements frequently wanted to gain control over monastic wealth rather than promote authentic spirituality. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, institutional reform has been driven by complex mixtures of genuine idealism and practical self-interest. and medieval convent reform demonstrates this pattern perfectly. The most successful reforms addressed real problems while serving the interests of powerful reformers, while failed reform attempts usually ignored one or both of these requirements. Of course, this doesn't mean that medieval reform movements were entirely cynical or manipulative. Many reformers were genuinely motivated by spiritual concerns and achieved real improvements in religious life. The Cistercian reform movement of the 12th century, for example, successfully established new forms of monastic life that combined spiritual rigor with practical effectiveness in ways that influenced European monasticism for centuries. Let's talk about some specific reform movements, because the patterns of success and failure reveal important truths about the relationship between religious ideals and social reality. The Cluniac reforms of the 10th and 11th centuries attempted to restore authentic Benedictine observance by increasing papal oversight and reducing secular interference in monastic affairs. This movement achieved significant success in male monasteries, but had more limited impact on female communities, partly because the social functions served by convents made complete independence from secular society impractical. Still, the most interesting aspect of medieval reform movements was how they often produced unintended consequences that transformed religious life in unexpected ways. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which aimed to increase clerical authority over religious institutions, actually enhanced the independence of some powerful abbesses who successfully claimed direct papal jurisdiction to avoid episcopal oversight. And yet, resistance to reform wasn't simply a matter of nuns preferring comfortable corruption to spiritual discipline. Many communities had developed religious practices that reflected mature adaptation to local circumstances and genuine spiritual insight that reformers didn't understand or appreciate. External attempts to impose uniform standards often disrupted authentic religious life in favor of theoretical ideals that worked better on paper than in practice. By the 13th century, some convents had become battlegrounds between competing reform movements that offered different visions of authentic religious life. The conflict between traditional Benedictine observance and newer Franciscan spirituality, for example, created factional disputes within religious communities that sometimes required papal intervention to resolve. Meanwhile, the relationship between reform and resistance reflected broader tensions within medieval Christianity between otherworldly ideals and practical social needs. Convents served multiple functions: spiritual, educational, economic, political, that made complete withdrawal from secular concerns impossible, regardless of theological preferences. Successful reforms found ways to preserve these social functions while addressing genuine spiritual concerns, while failed reforms usually ignored practical necessities in favor of abstract ideals. If you thought medieval people were more uniformly religious than modern populations, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by reform movements. The constant need for renewal suggests that medieval religious life was subject to the same human weaknesses and institutional pressures that affect religious communities today. The difference was that medieval society had fewer alternatives to religious institutions, making reform more crucial for social stability. To be fair, some convents successfully resisted reform movements that would have destroyed valuable spiritual traditions and cultural achievements. The preservation of intellectual and artistic traditions often required maintaining institutional arrangements that purist reformers found objectionable, but that were necessary for cultural continuity. Of course, the most dramatic reform conflicts occurred when external authorities attempted to impose changes that threatened the essential character of religious communities. The attempts to reform the Abbey of Las Huelgas in the 14th century, for example, met fierce resistance from nuns who argued correctly that the proposed changes would eliminate the community's unique spiritual traditions and social functions. Relationship between mystical spirituality and institutional reform was particularly complex. Some of the most profound spiritual innovations emerged from communities that violated technical monastic rules, while some of the most rigidly observant houses produced little of lasting spiritual value. This created ongoing tension between formal orthodoxy and authentic religious experience that reformers never satisfactorily resolved. Still, it's important to recognize that successful reform movements often produced genuine improvements in religious life that enhanced both spiritual development and social service. The best reforms addressed real problems while preserving valuable traditions, creating renewed forms of religious life that served both spiritual and practical needs more effectively than previous arrangements. And yet, the cyclical nature of medieval reform movements suggests that the tensions they addressed were inherent in the attempt to create perfect religious institutions within imperfect human society. Each generation of reformers discovered that their solutions created new problems that required further reform, establishing patterns of ongoing renewal that continue to characterize religious life today. By the later medieval period, some convents had learned to anticipate and manage reform pressures in ways that preserved institutional autonomy, while addressing legitimate concerns about spiritual and administrative standards. These communities developed internal renewal processes that prevented external intervention, while maintaining high standards of religious life. The ultimate lesson of medieval convent reform movements wasn't that religious institutions were inherently corrupt or that spiritual ideals were unattainable, but rather that authentic religious life requires ongoing balance between transcendent aspirations and practical necessities that can never be permanently resolved through institutional arrangements alone. Let's be honest about something that makes both skeptical historians and devout believers equally uncomfortable. Medieval convents were hotbeds of mystical experience that produced some of the most psychologically complex and theologically sophisticated spiritual literature in Christian history, often by women whose visions challenged orthodox doctrine in ways that church authorities found deeply threatening. That's right. While secular women were generally excluded from theological discourse and religious authority, female mystics used their claimed direct access to divine revelation to bypass normal ecclesiastical hierarchies and develop spiritual insights that influenced Christian thought for centuries. The protected environment of convent life provided the perfect incubator for mystical experiences that might have resulted in heresy charges if they'd occurred outside religious institutions. To understand the mystical culture that flourished in medieval convents, you need to grasp how the intense spiritual practices of monastic life could produce altered states of consciousness that mystics interpreted as divine encounters. Extended fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and repetitive prayer, all standard elements of medieval religious discipline, create psychological conditions that modern researchers recognize as conducive to visionary experiences. Meanwhile, the theological framework of medieval Christianity provided a rich symbolic vocabulary for interpreting unusual psychological states as communications from God, visions of heaven and hell, or encounters with saints and angels. Women who might be diagnosed with various psychological conditions today found in mystical interpretation a way to understand their experiences as spiritually meaningful rather than pathological. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, marginalized groups have used religious experience to claim authority and express insights that conventional social structures wouldn't allow them to develop or communicate. Medieval female mystics represent one of the most successful examples of this pattern. using supposed divine revelation to achieve influence that secular society would never have permitted. Of course, the Church's response to mystical claims was deeply ambivalent. On one hand, authentic divine revelation was central to Christian theology and couldn't be rejected without undermining fundamental doctrines. On the other hand, uncontrolled mystical experiences posed obvious threats to ecclesiastical authority and orthodox teaching. The result was an elaborate system for evaluating mystical claims that was inherently subjective and politically influenced. Let's talk about some specific examples, because the range and sophistication of medieval female mystical literature is genuinely remarkable. Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love presents complex theological insights about the nature of God, salvation, and human suffering that demonstrate profound spiritual and intellectual development. Her famous assertion that all shall be well wasn't naive optimism, but sophisticated theological reflection on divine love and cosmic purpose. Still, the most striking aspect of medieval female mysticism was how it combined intense personal spiritual experience with broader social and political commentary. Bridget of Sweden used her mystical authority to criticize papal politics, advocate for church reform, and influence international diplomacy in ways that would have been impossible for secular women to attempt. And yet, the line between authentic, mystical experience and creative spiritual imagination was often impossible to determine, even for contemporary observers. Medieval mystics themselves seem to have understood their visions as simultaneously real divine encounters and symbolic expressions of spiritual truths that transcended literal description. By the 14th century, some convents had developed cultures that actively encouraged mystical experience through spiritual practices, theological study, and community support that created optimal conditions for visionary development. These communities produced remarkable concentrations of mystical literature that influenced broader European spirituality in ways that are still being discovered by modern scholars. Meanwhile, the relationship between mystical experience and intellectual achievement was complex and varied among different personalities. Some mystics were highly educated women who used scholarly training to interpret and communicate their spiritual insights, while others were relatively unlearned, but developed sophisticated theological understanding through visionary experience. That challenged academic assumptions about religious knowledge. If you thought medieval mysticism was anti-intellectual or opposed to rational thought, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by figures like Mechthild of Magdeburg, whose spiritual writings demonstrate both intense mystical experience and careful theological reflection that integrates visionary insights with scholarly learning in innovative ways. To be fair, the mystical literature produced by medieval nuns often reflected the theological limitations and cultural assumptions of their historical period. Even the most radical mystical insights were usually expressed in orthodox language that preserved institutional relationships while communicating potentially subversive spiritual ideas. Of course, the most controversial aspect of medieval female mysticism was its implicit challenge to male clerical authority. When nuns claimed direct divine revelation that contradicted official church teaching or bypassed normal sacramental channels, they were asserting spiritual authority that threatened fundamental assumptions about religious hierarchy and gender roles. The relationship between mystical experience and physical manifestations was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Many female mystics reported dramatic bodily symptoms, stigmata, ecstatic trances, miraculous fasting, that served as external validation of their spiritual claims, while creating spectacles that attracted public attention and sometimes skeptical scrutiny. Still, it's important to recognize that medieval mystical literature often demonstrates genuine psychological insight and spiritual wisdom that transcends its historical context. The best mystical writers developed understanding of human nature, divine love, and spiritual development that continues to offer valuable resources for contemporary spiritual seekers. And yet, the institutionalization of mystical experience within convent life sometimes led to competitive dynamics where nuns felt pressured to produce increasingly dramatic, visionary claims to maintain their reputations for holiness. This created potential for both authentic spiritual development and manipulative self-promotion that observers found difficult to distinguish by the later medieval period. Some mystical nuns had achieved international reputations that made them influential figures in European politics and diplomacy. Catherine of Siena's mystical authority allowed her to correspond with popes and kings, advocate for church reform, and mediate international conflicts in ways that demonstrated the practical power that could accompany spiritual claims. The ultimate significance of medieval female mysticism wasn't just its immediate impact on Christian spirituality, but its demonstration that women could achieve profound spiritual insight and communicate complex theological ideas when given appropriate cultural frameworks and institutional support. This lesson would eventually influence broader discussions about female spiritual authority and religious leadership. Let's be clear about something that both Protestant and Catholic historians often misrepresent for their own purposes: the dissolution of medieval convents during the Protestant Reformation wasn't simply a matter of corrupt institutions being swept away by pure spiritual renewal, nor was it a tragic destruction of perfect religious communities by secular greed. The reality was far more complex and reveals as much about early modern politics as it does about religious reform. That's right, the end of the medieval convent system reflected fundamental changes in European society that went far beyond theological disputes about monastic life. Economic pressures, political centralization, changing gender roles, and new forms of religious expression all contributed to transformations that would have occurred regardless of specific reform movements, though the Reformation certainly accelerated and shaped these changes. To understand the dissolution of medieval convents, you need to grasp how these institutions had become integral to European social and economic structures in ways that made their elimination traumatic for entire communities. Convents weren't just religious houses. They were hospitals, schools, banks, and social services that provided crucial functions that secular institutions weren't yet prepared to assume. Meanwhile, the financial resources controlled by major convents made them attractive targets for secular rulers who were facing increasing pressure to fund professional armies, bureaucratic administration, and other expensive features of early modern government. The wealth that had made medieval abbesses powerful also made their institutions vulnerable when political circumstances changed. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, institutional changes that appear to be driven by high principles often reflect practical considerations that aren't always acknowledged by contemporary participants. The dissolution of convents combined genuine religious reform with economic opportunity and political calculation in ways that created lasting social transformation. Of course, the theological justifications for eliminating monastic life reflected real criticisms of medieval religious practice that had been developing for centuries. Protestant reformers argued that monastic vows contradicted biblical teaching about marriage and salvation, that religious life encouraged spiritual pride rather than humility, and that institutional wealth corrupted authentic spirituality. Let's talk about the specific process of dissolution, because it varied dramatically across different European regions and reflected local political circumstances as much as religious conviction. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries was primarily a political and financial operation that used religious justification to seize institutional wealth needed to fund royal government and reward political supporters. Still, The human cost of dissolution was enormous and often overlooked by historians who focus on institutional and theological issues. Thousands of women who had spent their entire adult lives in religious communities suddenly found themselves without homes, incomes, or social identities in societies that offered few alternatives for unmarried women. And yet, some nuns successfully adapted to changing circumstances and found new ways to express religious commitment within Protestant societies. Former abbesses used their administrative experience to manage estates, operate schools, or run charitable institutions that preserved some of the social functions of dissolved convents while adapting to new religious frameworks. By the mid-16th century, the convent system that had shaped European women's lives for over a millennium had largely disappeared from Protestant regions, though it continued to evolve in Catholic areas where reform movements attempted to address Protestant criticisms, while preserving monastic traditions. Meanwhile, the Counter-Reformation in Catholic territories produced new forms of female religious life that combined traditional monastic elements with active apostolic work in education, healthcare, and social service. Communities like the Ursulines and the Daughters of Charity represented innovative responses to changing social needs that maintained religious commitment while adapting to early modern circumstances. If you thought the Reformation simply eliminated medieval religious life, you need to consider how it actually transformed rather than destroyed many of the social functions that convents had served. Protestant societies developed new institutions, schools, hospitals, charitable organizations that preserved community services while eliminating specifically religious elements. To be fair, the dissolution of convents often eliminated valuable cultural and intellectual resources that weren't adequately replaced by secular alternatives. Libraries were dispersed, artistic traditions were lost, and educational opportunities for women were reduced in ways that took centuries to restore. Of course, the most tragic aspect of convent dissolution was how it eliminated one of the few career paths available to medieval women who wanted independence from family control and marriage expectations. The religious life had provided opportunities for education, administration, and social influence that secular society was slow to offer to women. The relationship between convent dissolution and changing marriage patterns was particularly significant, as Protestant theology emphasized marriage as the normal state for Christian women. Societies that had previously accommodated large numbers of unmarried religious women had to develop new social arrangements for managing gender roles in family structures. Still, it's important to recognize that some aspects of medieval convent life were genuinely problematic and needed reform or elimination. The forced religious profession of women against their will, the class distinctions that created inequality within religious communities, and the economic arrangements that enriched institutions while impoverishing local communities represented real abuses that justified critical attention. And yet, the wholesale elimination of female monastic life also eliminated positive features that early modern societies struggled to replace. The intellectual culture, artistic achievement, and social service that had flourished in medieval convents represent valuable contributions to European civilization that were lost, along with the institutional framework that had supported them. By the late 16th century, European women faced a dramatically different range of life options than their medieval predecessors. Marriage had become the overwhelmingly dominant expectation for women in Protestant societies, while Catholic regions maintained modified forms of religious life that combined traditional monastic elements with new forms of active ministry. The ultimate legacy of medieval convent dissolution wasn't the triumph of one religious vision over another, but the demonstration that institutional arrangements that seem permanent and natural can be rapidly transformed by changing social, economic, and political circumstances. The thousand-year tradition of female monastic life that had seemed eternal to medieval observers was largely eliminated within a few decades of the early 16th century. The lessons learned from this transformation about the relationship between religious institutions and social needs, about the importance of economic independence for institutional survival, and about the ways that spiritual ideals must adapt to changing historical circumstances, continue to influence discussions about religious life and women's roles in contemporary society. Let's be honest about something that's sanitized. Histories prefer to gloss over. The actual daily experience of medieval convent life was a bizarre mixture of rigid religious routine and creative rule-bending that would make modern workplace comedies seem tame by comparison. If you thought medieval nuns spent their days in silent contemplation, you clearly haven't read the episcopal visitation records that reveal communities where women developed elaborate systems for circumventing inconvenient regulations while maintaining the appearance of perfect religious observance. That's right. Behind the supposedly uniform facade of monastic discipline, individual convents developed their own cultures, traditions, and informal hierarchies that often bore little resemblance to official rules. The gap between what monastic regulations prescribed and what actually happened in daily convent life was often so wide that it's amazing anyone maintained the fiction that these institutions were following traditional religious practices. To understand the reality of medieval convent daily life, you need to start with the basic physical environment that shaped every aspect of community experience. Medieval convents were designed as enclosed worlds where every space had specific religious significance and practical function. The church occupied the ceremonial center, surrounded by the cloister where formal community life unfolded, with dormitories, refectories, chapter houses, and workspaces arranged to facilitate collective religious observance. Meanwhile, the actual use of these spaces often diverged dramatically from their intended purposes. Dormitories that were supposed to house nuns in individual cells became social centers where women gathered for conversation, games, and activities that had nothing to do with prayer or meditation. Chapter houses designed for serious discussions of religious matters became venues for political maneuvering and personal disputes that would have impressed Machiavelli. Sound familiar? It should. Human beings have always found ways to adapt institutional spaces to meet their actual needs rather than their supposed purposes. And medieval nuns were particularly creative in this regard. By the 14th century, many convents had developed informal systems for using official spaces in ways that served community social needs while technically maintaining compliance with monastic regulations. Of course, the daily schedule that supposedly governed convent life was equally subject to creative interpretation. The canonical hours, those 8 prayer services that punctuated every monastic day from matins before dawn to compline after sunset, were supposed to create a rhythm of spiritual discipline that eliminated private time and personal preference in favor of collective religious observance. Let's talk about how this actually worked in practice, because medieval chronicles preserve accounts of communities where the canonical hours became increasingly abbreviated, optional, or simply ignored, as other activities took precedence. By the later medieval period, some convents had reduced the daily prayer schedule to brief services that lasted just long enough to satisfy technical requirements, while leaving most of the day available for other pursuits. Still, the most fascinating aspect of daily convent life was how women used the protected environment of religious institutions to develop forms of female culture that would have been impossible in secular society. Within convent walls, women could maintain intense friendships, pursue intellectual interests, develop artistic skills, and exercise authority over their own communities in ways that marriage and family life rarely permitted. And yet, this freedom operated within constraints that created constant tension between individual desires and community obligations. The collective nature of monastic life meant that personal preferences had to be negotiated through group dynamics that could be supportive or oppressive, depending on the particular community culture that developed within each institution. By the 13th century, many convents had evolved elaborate systems of private property that allowed individual nuns to maintain personal possessions, private quarters, and even household staff while technically observing vows of poverty. These arrangements created internal economies within religious communities that paralleled and sometimes contradicted the broader economic structures that connected convents to secular society. Meanwhile, the social hierarchies that developed within convent communities often reflected broader class distinctions that monastic ideals were supposed to eliminate. Aristocratic nuns maintained privileged positions, better living conditions, and greater personal freedom than their lower-class sisters, creating internal social structures that reproduced rather than challenged secular inequality. If you thought religious life automatically eliminated worldly concerns and social distinctions, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by medieval convent culture. The women who entered these institutions brought their social backgrounds, personal ambitions, and cultural expectations with them, and these influences shaped community life in ways that often overwhelmed official religious purposes. To be fair, many aspects of daily convent life did serve genuine spiritual and educational functions that benefited both individual nuns and broader society. The regular schedule of prayer and meditation, even when abbreviated or modified, provided structure and meaning that many women found psychologically beneficial. The emphasis on literacy and learning, even when it extended beyond strictly religious subjects, created educational opportunities that secular society generally denied to women. Of course, the work requirements that were supposed to prevent idleness and maintain community self-sufficiency often became sophisticated business operations that required advanced administrative and technical skills. Convent scriptoriums, textile workshops, agricultural management, and financial administration provided practical training that prepared women for leadership roles both within and outside religious institutions. The relationship between individual privacy and community life was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Official regulations emphasized collective observance and communal sharing that were supposed to eliminate personal preference and private concerns. In practice, most convents developed systems that balance community obligations with individual needs in ways that preserve both social cohesion and personal autonomy. Still, the informal networks of friendship, mentorship, and alliance that developed within convent communities often became more significant than official hierarchies, based on religious rank or administrative position. These personal relationships shaped everything from daily routine to major institutional decisions in ways that external authorities found difficult to understand or control. And yet, the collective nature of convent life also created opportunities for mutual support and collaborative achievement that would have been impossible for isolated individuals. Women who might have had little influence or recognition in secular society could work together to accomplish educational, artistic, and social projects that enhanced both their own lives and their broader communities. By the later medieval period, some convents had developed cultures that successfully integrated religious observance with intellectual pursuits, artistic creativity, and social engagement in ways that created genuinely fulfilling community life. These institutions demonstrated that alternative forms of social organization could provide meaningful alternatives to conventional marriage and family arrangements while serving important social functions. The ultimate significance of medieval convent daily life wasn't its conformity to official religious ideals, but its demonstration of female capacity for creating supportive communities and meaningful work when given appropriate institutional frameworks, and social protection. The creative adaptations that medieval nuns developed to make monastic life livable revealed both the limitations of official regulations and the resilience of human nature in finding ways to thrive within restrictive circumstances. Let's be clear about something that both feminist historians and traditional religious scholars often misunderstand. The legacy of medieval convent culture isn't simply about women's oppression or liberation, but about the complex ways that human beings create meaning, community, and achievement within whatever institutional frameworks they inherit, regardless of whether those frameworks were designed to serve their actual needs and capabilities. That's right, the 1,000-year experiment in female religious life that we've explored tonight offers lessons that extend far beyond medieval history or women's studies. These communities demonstrated alternative approaches to organizing work, education, social relationships, and spiritual development that challenge assumptions about human nature and social organization that continue to influence contemporary debates about everything from gender equality to community structure to the role of institutions in human flourishing. To understand what medieval nuns can teach modern audiences, you need to start with their most fundamental achievement, creating sustainable communities that served multiple social functions while providing individual members with opportunities for personal development, meaningful work, and social influence that secular society generally denied to women. This wasn't a simple matter of religious devotion overcoming social constraints. It required sophisticated organizational skills, political maneuvering, and creative adaptation that demonstrated capabilities that official medieval culture claimed women didn't possess. Meanwhile, the intellectual and artistic achievements that emerged from medieval convent culture, achievements that we've documented throughout this exploration, prove that restrictions on human potential are generally artificial rather than natural. When medieval women gained access to education, resources, and supportive community, they produced work that rivaled anything created by their male contemporaries, suggesting that gender limitations in other historical contexts reflected social arrangements rather than inherent differences in capability. Sound familiar? It should. Contemporary discussions about workplace equality, educational access, and social organization continue to grapple with questions about how institutional arrangements either support or constrain human potential. Medieval convents provide historical examples of alternative approaches that achieve remarkable results while operating within broader social systems that were often hostile to female achievement. Of course, the political skills that medieval abbesses developed in managing complex institutions, negotiating with powerful secular and religious authorities, and maintaining community cohesion despite internal conflicts demonstrate leadership capabilities that challenge stereotypes about female management styles and political effectiveness. These women weren't operating in supportive environments designed to facilitate their success. They were achieving remarkable results, despite institutional and cultural obstacles that would have defeated less determined or skilled leaders. Let's talk about the economic lessons that emerge from medieval convent history, because these institutions pioneered organizational and financial practices that anticipated modern corporate structures, while maintaining social missions that purely profit-driven enterprises often abandon. Medieval abbesses learned to balance financial sustainability with social service, individual advancement with community welfare, and institutional independence with external relationships in ways that created long-term organizational success. Still, perhaps the most important lesson from medieval convent culture concerns the relationship between individual fulfillment and community belonging. These institutions created environments where personal development and collective achievement reinforced rather than competed with each other, demonstrating that the modern assumption about inevitable conflict between individual and social goals may reflect cultural limitations rather than inherent human nature. And yet, the failures and limitations of medieval convent life are equally instructive for contemporary audiences. The class distinctions that persisted within supposedly egalitarian religious communities, the creative corruption that accompanied financial success, and the personal conflicts that sometimes destroyed community harmony remind us that institutional arrangements alone don't guarantee positive outcomes. Human nature includes capacities for both remarkable cooperation and spectacular dysfunction, and even the best institutional designs must account for these realities. By examining how medieval nuns navigated the contradictions between spiritual ideals and practical necessities, contemporary readers can gain insight into ongoing challenges facing any organization that attempts to serve both transcendent purposes and immediate human needs. The tensions that shaped medieval convent life, between individual autonomy and collective responsibility, between institutional stability and necessary change, between idealistic goals and practical constraints, continue to characterize most human institutions today. Meanwhile, the creative ways that medieval nuns bent, adapted, and sometimes ignored official regulations while maintaining institutional loyalty demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to work within imperfect systems while preserving personal integrity and advancing important goals. These women developed strategies for institutional survival and personal achievement that remain relevant for anyone operating within bureaucratic or hierarchical organizations. If you thought medieval people were more uniformly religious or socially conservative than modern populations, you need to reconsider the evidence we've examined tonight. Medieval nuns demonstrated the same range of responses to institutional constraints that characterize contemporary organizations. Some thrived within traditional structures. Others found creative ways to modify those structures, and still, others openly challenged arrangements they found intolerable. To be fair, the social and economic circumstances that made medieval convents necessary and possible no longer exist in most contemporary societies. Modern women have access to educational and professional opportunities that medieval society generally denied, reducing the need for separate female institutions to provide these services. Similarly, modern social services, healthcare systems, and educational institutions have assumed many of the functions that medieval convents once served. Of course, this doesn't mean that the organizational innovations and social experiments represented by medieval convents are irrelevant to contemporary life. Current discussions about alternative family structures, intentional communities, work-life balance, and social enterprise continue to explore many of the same questions that shaped medieval convent development: how to create sustainable communities that serve both individual and social needs while maintaining values and purposes that transcend immediate material concerns. The relationship between spiritual purpose and practical achievement that characterized the best medieval convents offers particularly valuable insights for contemporary organizations struggling to maintain idealistic missions while operating within competitive market environments. Medieval abbesses learned to be simultaneously visionary leaders and hard-headed administrators, demonstrating that effective leadership often requires integration of seemingly contradictory capabilities. Still, the most profound lesson from medieval convent history may concern the importance of creating institutions that provide alternatives to dominant social arrangements rather than simply trying to reform existing structures. Medieval convents succeeded precisely because they offered women opportunities to opt out of conventional marriage and family life while still maintaining social respectability and meaningful work. And yet, the eventual dissolution of most medieval convents during the Reformation demonstrates that even successful alternative institutions remain vulnerable to broader social and political changes that can eliminate their social niche or economic foundation. This suggests that sustainable social innovation requires ongoing adaptation and political engagement rather than simple withdrawal from mainstream society. By the time we reach the end of our exploration, what emerges most clearly is that medieval nuns weren't historical curiosities or religious anachronisms, but rather creative social innovators who developed practical solutions to problems that continue to challenge contemporary society. Their achievements and failures, innovations and limitations, successes and scandals provide valuable case studies for anyone interested in how human beings create meaning, community, and achievement within institutional frameworks that were never designed to serve their actual needs. The ultimate legacy of medieval convent culture isn't a set of specific practices or institutional arrangements that should be imitated, but rather a demonstration that alternative approaches to organizing human life are possible and can achieve remarkable results when supported by appropriate social and economic resources. This lesson remains relevant for contemporary efforts to create more inclusive, sustainable, and fulfilling forms of social organization. Perhaps most importantly, the women whose stories we've explored tonight remind us that historical change happens through the accumulation of individual choices made by people who refuse to accept that existing arrangements represent the limits of human possibility. Medieval nuns created the lives they wanted by working within, around, and sometimes against the institutional constraints they inherited, leaving behind examples of creativity, resilience, and achievement that continue to inspire anyone seeking to create meaningful alternatives to conventional social arrangements. Let's be honest about something that makes both medieval historians and political scientists deeply uncomfortable. Some of the most sophisticated intelligence networks, diplomatic conspiracies, and international political operations in medieval Europe were orchestrated by nuns who used the supposed otherworldliness of religious life as perfect cover for activities that would make modern spy agencies envious. That's right. While everyone assumed that women behind convent walls were focused on prayer and contemplation, savvy abbesses were developing communication networks that spanned continents, gathering political intelligence that influenced royal policies, and coordinating international conspiracies that shaped the course of European history. The protected status of religious institutions, combined with the assumption that women couldn't possibly understand complex political affairs, created ideal conditions for covert operations that male authorities never suspected to understand. The scope of medieval convent political networks. You need to grasp how the international structure of religious orders created communication channels that bypassed normal diplomatic and commercial routes. A letter from the abbess of Fontevraud to her daughter house in England could carry political intelligence, financial information, or strategic coordination that secular authorities would never think to intercept because it appeared to be routine. Religious correspondence. Meanwhile, the constant flow of visitors, pilgrims, and travelers through major convents provided perfect opportunities for gathering and disseminating information that had nothing to do with spiritual matters. Abbesses who welcomed prominent guests weren't just performing religious hospitality. They were operating intelligence-gathering operations that collected political gossip, economic data, and strategic information from across their networks. Of contacts. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, institutions that appear to be removed from political affairs often become ideal platforms for covert operations, precisely because their apparent irrelevance makes them invisible to security concerns. Medieval convents perfected this dynamic long before modern intelligence agencies understood its potential. Of course, the political education that many abbesses received through managing complex institutions, negotiating with powerful authorities, and mediating disputes prepared them perfectly for understanding and manipulating broader political dynamics. Women who could successfully navigate ecclesiastical politics manage international financial operations, and coordinate multi-generational institutional strategies were obviously capable of much more sophisticated political analysis than contemporary assumptions about female intellectual capacity suggested. Let's talk about some specific examples, because medieval chronicles preserve accounts of convent-based political operations that are genuinely shocking in their scope and sophistication. The Abbey of Las Huelgas served as an unofficial headquarters for coordinating resistance to various political reforms that threatened monastic privileges, using its network of daughter houses and allied institutions to organize opposition campaigns. That influenced royal policies across multiple kingdoms. Still, the most remarkable aspect of medieval convent political networks was how they operated across the supposedly rigid boundaries that separated different kingdoms, languages, and cultures. Religious orders created transnational communities that maintained loyalty to institutional goals rather than secular rulers, making them ideal vehicles for political operations that required coordination across political boundaries. And yet, these international networks also created opportunities for genuine diplomatic service that enhanced rather than threatened political stability. Abbesses, who maintained correspondence with religious communities throughout Europe, could serve as unofficial ambassadors, mediating conflicts between secular rulers and providing communication channels when formal diplomatic relationships had broken down. By the 13th century, some abbesses had become so skilled at international politics that secular rulers actively sought their advice on diplomatic strategy, military planning, and economic policy. The Abbess of Fontevraud regularly corresponded with English, French, and Spanish royal courts, providing analysis and recommendations that influenced major political decisions throughout Western Europe. Meanwhile, the financial networks that connected medieval convents created opportunities for economic espionage and market manipulation that would impress modern corporate strategists. Abbesses who controlled extensive agricultural estates, urban properties, and commercial enterprises had access to economic intelligence that made them valuable allies or dangerous enemies for secular authorities attempting to manage royal finances. If you thought medieval women were excluded from serious political and economic affairs, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by convent political networks. These institutions created parallel power structures that operated alongside and sometimes in opposition to official governmental authorities, demonstrating that formal exclusion from political participation doesn't necessarily prevent effective political influence. To be fair, the covert nature of most convent political operations makes it difficult to assess their actual impact on historical events. Unlike secular political activities, which were usually documented in official records, religious political networks operated through informal channels that left few traces in historical sources. This means that modern historians have probably underestimated the political significance of medieval convents because their most important activities were deliberately hidden from contemporary observation. Of course, the most dramatic examples of convent political involvement occurred during periods of dynastic crisis, religious conflict, or international warfare when normal political institutions failed to provide adequate leadership or coordination. During these crises, religious networks often provided the only stable communication and organizational infrastructure available for coordinating resistance, negotiating settlements, or maintaining social order. The relationship between mystical authority and political influence was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Nuns, who claimed divine revelation, could use their supposed supernatural insights to justify political positions, influence royal decisions, and mobilize popular support in ways that secular advisors couldn't attempt. Bridget of Sweden's political interventions, for example, derived their effectiveness partly from her reputation for prophetic visions that gave her recommendations special authority. Still, it's important to recognize that convent political networks weren't simply vehicles for female ambition or institutional self-interest. Many abbesses used their political influence to advocate for social reforms, protect vulnerable populations, and promote policies that served broader community welfare rather than narrow institutional advantages. And yet, the temptation to use political influence for personal or institutional benefit sometimes led to corruption and abuse that justified contemporary suspicions about religious involvement in secular affairs. Medieval chronicles preserve accounts of abbesses who sold political influence, manipulated royal succession disputes for institutional advantage, and engaged in conspiracy activities that threatened rather than served social stability. By the 14th century, some convent political networks had become so extensive and sophisticated that they functioned almost as shadow governments that paralleled and sometimes challenged official political authorities. These networks created alternative channels for policy development, resource allocation, and social coordination that operated outside normal governmental structures. The ultimate significance of medieval convent political networks wasn't their immediate impact on specific historical events, but their demonstration that effective political organization can emerge from unexpected sources when existing institutional arrangements fail to serve important social needs. Religious institutions that appeared to be removed from worldly concerns often provided crucial political leadership during periods when secular authorities proved inadequate to address complex challenges. The intelligence gathering capabilities that medieval abbesses developed through managing international religious networks, combined with their analytical skills honed through institutional administration and theological study, created a class of political operators whose sophistication has been consistently underestimated by historians who assumed that religious women couldn't possibly understand complex political affairs. Meanwhile, the international scope of convent political activities demonstrates that medieval Europe was far more integrated and cosmopolitan than nationalist historical narratives typically acknowledge. Religious networks created transnational communities that maintained regular communication, coordinated policy development, and shared resources across political boundaries that secular institutions found difficult to transcend. The lessons that emerged from studying medieval convent political networks remain relevant for understanding how marginalized groups can develop effective political influence through institutional innovation, strategic communication, and creative use of apparently non-political resources. These historical examples provide valuable case studies for contemporary efforts to create alternative forms of political organization and social coordination. Let's be clear about something that both economic historians and church apologists prefer to ignore. Medieval convents weren't just centers of spiritual life and cultural achievement. They were also hubs of sophisticated criminal enterprises that would make modern organized crime families envious. The combination of extensive financial resources, international networks, legal privileges, and assumptions about religious innocence created perfect conditions for illegal activities that operated on scales that secular criminals could never achieve. That's right. Behind the facade of holy poverty and spiritual otherworldliness, some medieval convents operated smuggling rings, money laundering operations, counterfeiting schemes, and black market enterprises that generated enormous profits while maintaining perfect legal cover through their religious status. The same networks that facilitated legitimate religious and cultural exchange also provided ideal infrastructure for criminal activities that exploited the gap between religious ideals and economic realities. To understand the scope of criminal activity within medieval convent culture, you need to grasp how the legal privileges accorded to religious institutions created opportunities for abuse that secular authorities found difficult to investigate or prosecute. Convents enjoy ecclesiastical immunity that protected them from normal law enforcement, maintained extensive international connections that facilitated cross-border operations, and controlled resources that made large-scale criminal enterprises financially feasible. Meanwhile, the assumption that religious women were too unworldly and spiritually focused to engage in sophisticated criminal planning meant that secular authorities rarely suspected convents of too unworldly and spiritually focused to engage in sophisticated criminal planning meant that secular authorities rarely suspected convents of were too unworldly and spiritually focused planning meant that secular authorities rarely suspected convents of contents of voyage involvement in illegal activities, even when evidence suggested religious institutions were serving as bases for criminal operations that affected entire regions. Sound familiar? It should throughout history. Institutions that enjoy special legal status and public trust have often attracted criminal exploitation, precisely because their privileged position makes detection and prosecution more difficult. Medieval convents pioneered many of the techniques that modern criminal organizations use to exploit institutional legitimacy for illegal purposes. Of course, the international scope of religious orders created communication and transportation networks that were ideally suited for smuggling operations that required moving goods, money, and people across political boundaries without attracting official attention. A shipment of religious books or liturgical supplies traveling between affiliated convents could easily conceal contraband materials that would generate enormous profits in black markets throughout Europe. Let's talk about some specific criminal enterprises, because medieval records preserve accounts of convent-based illegal activities that reveal remarkable sophistication and scope. The Abbey of Sant Pere de les Puels in Barcelona became notorious for operating currency exchange schemes that exploited differences in metal content and legal tender status between different kingdoms, generating profits that exceeded the legitimate revenues of most secular businesses. Still, the most lucrative criminal enterprises operated by medieval convents involved exploiting their privileged access to scarce commodities like precious metals, rare books, religious relics, and luxury goods that commanded premium prices in international markets. Abbesses who controlled extensive libraries could easily sell rare manuscripts to private collectors while claiming the works had been damaged or lost, generating significant income that never appeared in official financial records. And yet, the line between legitimate business practice and criminal activity was often unclear in medieval commercial culture, where concepts of intellectual property, standardized currency, and regulated trade were poorly developed. Some activities that modern observers might consider criminal were actually accepted business practices that reflected different assumptions about property rights and commercial ethics. By the 14th century, some convents had developed such extensive criminal enterprises that they functioned essentially as medieval crime syndicates that used religious identity as cover for activities that included everything from human trafficking to arms smuggling to large-scale financial fraud. These operations required sophisticated organizational skills, international coordination, and political protection that demonstrated capabilities that official assumptions about female intellectual capacity suggested were impossible. Meanwhile, the financial crimes perpetrated by some medieval convents anticipated modern corporate fraud techniques in ways that demonstrate remarkable innovation and sophistication. Abbesses who managed complex institutional finances developed creative accounting practices that concealed illegal activities, manipulated auditing procedures, and exploited regulatory loopholes in ways that wouldn't be out of place in contemporary white-collar crime investigations. If you thought medieval financial systems were too primitive to support sophisticated criminal enterprises, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by convent criminal activities. These institutions pioneered techniques for money laundering, tax evasion, and financial manipulation that required advanced understanding of international commercial networks and regulatory systems. To be fair, many criminal activities associated with medieval convents reflected desperate responses to economic pressures rather than pure greed or criminal intent. Institutions that faced financial crises due to war damage, natural disasters, or political persecution sometimes turned to illegal activities as survival strategies when legitimate sources of income proved inadequate to maintain essential social services. Of course, the most serious criminal enterprises involved activities that threatened social stability and public safety rather than simply generating illegal profits. Some convents became involved in political conspiracies, assassination plots, and military operations that used religious cover to facilitate activities that could destabilize entire kingdoms if discovered and prosecuted. The relationship between religious authority and criminal immunity was particularly problematic in medieval legal culture. Church authorities who discovered criminal activities within religious institutions often covered up rather than prosecuted these crimes to protect institutional reputation and maintain public confidence in religious leadership. This created cultures of impunity that encouraged rather than deterred criminal behavior. Still, it's important to recognize that criminal activities within medieval convents were exceptional rather than typical, and most religious communities maintained high standards of legal and ethical conduct throughout their existence. The criminal enterprises that did develop usually reflected broader institutional failures and social pressures rather than inherent corruption within religious life. And yet, the criminal innovations developed by some medieval convents had lasting influence on European commercial and legal culture. Techniques for international financial transfer, complex business organization, and regulatory manipulation that were pioneered by religious criminals were eventually adopted by legitimate businesses and incorporated into standard commercial practices. By the later medieval period, secular authorities had begun developing investigative and prosecutorial techniques specifically designed to address criminal activities within religious institutions. These efforts led to some spectacular trials and convictions that revealed the scope of criminal enterprises that had operated under religious cover for decades without detection. The economic impact of criminal activities associated with medieval convents was often significant enough to affect regional and international markets. Large-scale counterfeiting operations, for example, could destabilize currency systems and disrupt legitimate commerce in ways that required coordinated governmental response to prevent broader economic damage. Meanwhile, the social impact of convent criminal activities often extended far beyond immediate financial damage. When religious institutions that communities depended on for social services, education, and charitable support were revealed to be involved in criminal enterprises, the resulting loss of public trust could undermine social stability and religious authority in ways that took generations to repair. The ultimate lesson from studying criminal activities within medieval convent culture isn't that religious institutions are inherently corrupt or that spiritual ideals inevitably succumb to worldly temptations. Instead, these historical examples demonstrate how institutional privileges and social assumptions can create opportunities for criminal exploitation that require ongoing vigilance and accountability, measures to prevent and address the investigative techniques that medieval authorities developed to address religious criminal enterprises anticipated modern approaches to white-collar crime prosecution and organizational accountability. These historical precedents provide valuable insights for contemporary efforts to prevent and prosecute institutional criminal activity while preserving legitimate religious freedom and organizational autonomy. Let's be honest about something that makes both religious authorities and academic historians profoundly uncomfortable. Medieval convents were hotbeds of sexual experimentation, romantic passion, and erotic expression that would make modern dating apps seem prudish by comparison. If you thought taking vows of chastity automatically eliminated sexual desire, you clearly haven't read the secret correspondence, hidden diaries, and scandalous chronicles that reveal communities where women developed sophisticated cultures of physical intimacy, emotional passion, and sexual creativity that flourished despite, or perhaps because of, official prohibition. That's right. Behind the supposed purity of religious life, medieval nuns were engaging in sexual relationships, romantic affairs, and erotic practices that challenged every assumption about female sexuality, religious discipline, and institutional control. The closed environment of convent life, combined with the intense emotional bonds that developed between women living in close proximity for decades, created perfect conditions for sexual relationships that were simultaneously forbidden and inevitable. To understand the erotic culture that flourished within medieval convents, you need to start with the basic psychological reality that confining sexually mature women in closed communities and expecting them to maintain perfect chastity for their entire adult lives was frankly a recipe for creative rule-bending that would impress modern relationship counselors. Human sexuality doesn't disappear because of institutional regulations, and medieval nuns found remarkably inventive ways to express physical and emotional needs within the constraints of religious life. Meanwhile, the homosocial environment of convent communities created opportunities for same-sex relationships that secular society generally didn't permit or acknowledge. Within convent walls, women could develop intense emotional bonds, express physical affection, and maintain exclusive partnerships that would have been impossible in the heterosexual marriage culture that dominated medieval society. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, single-sex institutions have provided spaces for homosexual relationships to develop and flourish, often with tacit institutional tolerance, as long as these relationships don't openly challenge official policies. Medieval convents pioneered many of the social dynamics that modern LGBTQ+ communities recognize as familiar patterns of institutional negotiation and community building. Of course, the theological framework of medieval Christianity provided complex justifications for intense female relationships that could be interpreted as either spiritually beneficial or physically dangerous, depending on political circumstances and individual personalities involved. The concept of spiritual friendship allowed for emotional intimacy that could easily cross boundaries into physical expression without necessarily requiring theological condemnation. Let's talk about some specific examples. Because medieval chronicles preserve accounts of convent sexual relationships that are remarkable for their passion, complexity, and sometimes tragic consequences. The Abbey of Saint-Père-de-l'Espoils became notorious in the 13th century for a series of scandals involving nuns who maintained exclusive partnerships that disrupted community harmony and attracted episcopal investigation when jealousy and competition led to public disputes. Still, the most fascinating aspect of medieval convent sexual culture was how it developed its own ethics, practices, and social arrangements that created alternative models of romantic relationship that had little in common with contemporary heterosexual marriage. These communities evolved systems for managing emotional jealousy, negotiating sexual partnerships, and maintaining discretion that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. And yet, the line between acceptable spiritual intimacy and forbidden sexual behavior was often impossible to determine, even for the women involved. Medieval concepts of female sexuality were poorly developed, and many nuns seem to have engaged in physical relationships without fully understanding the theological or institutional implications of their behavior. By the 14th century, some convents had developed cultures that openly tolerated or even celebrated romantic relationships between women, treating exclusive partnerships as spiritually beneficial rather than morally problematic. These communities created social arrangements that provided emotional support, physical intimacy, and domestic partnership that enriched rather than threatened religious life. Meanwhile, the relationships between nuns and male visitors, chaplains, confessors, administrative staff, and various hangers-on created opportunities for heterosexual relationships that posed obvious challenges to monastic discipline. Despite elaborate precautions designed to limit contact between nuns and men, romantic connections inevitably developed through correspondence, brief encounters, and sometimes sustained affairs that resulted in pregnancies requiring creative, theological explanations. If you thought medieval people were more sexually repressed than modern populations, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by convent sexual culture. The artificial constraints of religious life seem to have intensified rather than eliminated sexual desire, leading to more rather than less creative sexual expression. Among women who found conventional marriage unattractive or impossible. To be fair, many nuns successfully maintained their vows of chastity throughout long religious careers, finding fulfillment in spiritual devotion and community service that made sexual relationships unnecessary or undesirable. But even in the most disciplined communities, the natural human need for physical and emotional intimacy created pressures that sometimes erupted in dramatic fashion. Of course, the most scandalous sexual relationships within medieval convents involved power dynamics that created opportunities for exploitation and abuse that mirrored problems in contemporary institutional settings. Abbesses who used their authority to coerce sexual relationships with subordinate nuns, or male church authorities who exploited their privileged access to religious communities, represent forms of sexual misconduct that caused genuine harm and justified reform efforts. The relationship between mystical spirituality and sexual experience was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Some nuns channeled sexual energy into intense spiritual experiences that bordered on the erotic, while others found that spiritual ecstasy awakened physical desires that demanded satisfaction through more conventional means. The theological language used to describe divine love often employed explicitly sexual imagery that could blur boundaries between spiritual and physical experience. Still, it's important to recognize that not all sexual relationships within medieval convents were secretive or guilt-ridden. Some communities developed cultures that integrated physical intimacy with spiritual development, treating romantic partnerships as expressions of divine love rather than violations of religious discipline. These relationships could provide emotional support and personal fulfillment that enhanced rather than threatened religious commitment. And yet, the secretive nature of most convent sexual relationships created psychological pressures that could be destructive for individual participants and community harmony. Women who lived in constant fear of discovery, or who experienced conflicts between sexual desires and religious commitments, sometimes suffered mental health problems that monastic life was supposed to prevent rather than cause. By the later medieval period, some convents had become notorious for sexual laxity that attracted satirical attention from contemporary writers and reformist criticism from church authorities. These institutions developed reputations that made them attractive destinations for women seeking sexual freedom rather than spiritual development, creating cultures that prioritize personal pleasure over religious discipline. The ultimate irony of sexual regulation within medieval convents was that institutions designed to eliminate worldly temptation often created more intense and complex sexual cultures than existed in secular society. The forbidden nature of romantic relationships, combined with the closed environment of religious communities, produced sexual dynamics that were simultaneously more repressed and more liberated than conventional medieval marriage culture. The Correspondence and literary works produced by medieval nuns often contain coded references to sexual relationships, romantic longings, and erotic fantasies that reveal sophisticated understanding of human sexuality and creative approaches to expressing desires that couldn't be acknowledged openly. These texts provide valuable insights into female sexual experience that complement and sometimes contradict official theological teachings about appropriate religious behavior. Meanwhile, the medical knowledge that some medieval nuns developed through caring for sick community members included understanding of female anatomy, reproductive health, and sexual function that was often more accurate and practical than contemporary male medical authorities possessed. This knowledge sometimes supported sexual relationships by providing practical guidance about contraception, sexual technique, and physical health that enhanced rather than threatened community welfare. The social networks that connected different convent communities sometimes facilitated romantic relationships between women in different institutions, creating long-distance partnerships that were maintained through correspondence, visits, and transfers between communities. These relationships demonstrate that medieval women were capable of sustaining complex emotional commitments despite institutional obstacles and geographical separation. Still, the most profound impact of sexual relationships within medieval convents may have been their demonstration that alternative forms of romantic partnership were possible and could provide personal fulfillment that conventional marriage often failed to deliver. These historical examples of female-centered relationships, chosen partnerships, and sexually egalitarian communities anticipated modern discussions about relationship diversity and sexual autonomy in ways that continue to influence contemporary LGBTQ+ culture and feminist theory. The regulatory efforts that church authorities developed to control sexual behavior within religious communities created elaborate systems of surveillance, confession, and punishment that anticipated modern approaches to institutional sexual misconduct, while often failing to address the underlying human needs that motivated the behavior they were attempting to eliminate. These historical precedents provide valuable insights for contemporary discussions about sexuality, institutional authority, and community standards in religious and secular contexts. Let's be honest about something that both church historians and modern occultists consistently misrepresent for their own purposes. Medieval convents weren't just centers of Orthodox Christian spirituality. They were also hotbeds of magical practice, supernatural experimentation, and occult knowledge that would make contemporary witches weep with envy. If you thought medieval nuns were uniformly focused on approved religious activities, you clearly haven't examined the hidden libraries, secret rituals, and clandestine practices that flourished behind convent walls where women had access to ancient texts, herbal knowledge, and mystical traditions that secular authorities couldn't control or suppress. That's right. While everyone assumed that women in religious life were safely confined to Orthodox prayer and devotional reading, many medieval nuns were actually preserving, practicing, and developing magical traditions that connected them to pre-Christian spiritual practices, classical mystery religions, and esoteric knowledge systems that church authorities would have condemned as diabolic. If they'd understood what was actually happening in scriptorium corners and herb gardens throughout Europe, to understand the magical culture that flourished within medieval convents, you need to grasp how the combination of literacy, access to ancient texts, knowledge of medicinal herbs, and freedom from male supervision created perfect conditions for occult experimentation. Nuns who could read Latin had access to classical texts on magic, astrology, and natural philosophy that contained practical instructions for supernatural practices. Women who managed convent gardens and infirmaries developed sophisticated knowledge of plant properties that could be used for healing, divination, and magical purposes that went far beyond approved medical applications. Meanwhile, the mystical Experiences that many nuns cultivated through legitimate religious practices often opened doorways to supernatural phenomena that couldn't be easily categorized as either orthodox spirituality or heretical magic. Visions, prophecies, miraculous healings, and ecstatic states that were officially attributed to divine intervention sometimes involved techniques and experiences that had more in common with pagan shamanism than Christian mysticism. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout history, women have used whatever intellectual and spiritual resources they could access to explore supernatural possibilities. And medieval convents provided unprecedented opportunities for magical experimentation. By educated women who had time, resources, and institutional protection to develop occult practices that would have been dangerous or impossible in secular contexts. Of course, the line between acceptable religious practice and forbidden magical activity was often impossibly thin and politically determined. The same visionary experiences that could lead to sainthood could also result in accusations of witchcraft, depending largely on political circumstances and institutional relationships that had little to do with the actual content of supernatural practices. Successful magical practitioners learned to present their activities in orthodox language that emphasized divine inspiration rather than human technique. Let's talk about some specific examples, because medieval records preserve accounts of convent-based magical practices that are remarkable for their sophistication and scope. Hildegard of Bingen's medical and scientific writings contain detailed instructions for using herbs, stones, and astronomical observations in ways that combine empirical knowledge with magical theory that influenced European occult traditions. For centuries, her Physica and Causa et Cure read like comprehensive grimoires disguised as medical texts. Still, the most fascinating aspect of medieval convent magical culture was how it preserved and transmitted ancient knowledge systems that might otherwise have been lost during the Christian transformation of European culture. Nuns who copied classical texts didn't just preserve their literal content. They often understood and practiced the magical techniques described in works by authors like Pliny, Dioscorides, and various pseudonymous magical treatises that circulated throughout the medieval period. And yet, the relationship between Christian theology and magical practice wasn't necessarily antagonistic. Many medieval nuns developed syncretic spiritual systems that integrated orthodox religious beliefs with occult practices in ways that enhanced rather than contradicted their religious commitments. Prayer and magical ritual could reinforce each other when both were understood as techniques for accessing supernatural power through different but compatible approaches. By the 13th century, some convents had developed reputations for supernatural abilities that attracted visitors seeking magical services, healing impossible diseases, finding lost objects, predicting the future, or obtaining supernatural protection from various dangers. These institutions operated essentially as medieval magical consultancies that provided occult services while maintaining religious respectability through careful presentation of their activities as divinely inspired rather than technically accomplished. Meanwhile, the astrological knowledge that many educated nuns possessed enabled them to practice forms of divination and timing that were considered essential for effective magical work. Women who understood planetary influences, lunar cycles, and stellar conjunctions could coordinate ritual activities, predict favorable circumstances, and interpret supernatural signs in ways that enhanced their reputations for prophetic ability and mystical insight. If you thought medieval Christianity successfully eliminated magical thinking and practice, you need to reconsider the evidence provided by convent occult culture. These institutions often preserved magical traditions more successfully than secular practitioners could manage because their religious status provided protection from persecution, while their educational resources enabled sophisticated development of occult knowledge systems. To be fair, The magical practices developed within medieval convents often reflected genuine spiritual seeking and desire to help others rather than simple superstition or charlatan manipulation. Many nuns who engaged in magical activities were attempting to access supernatural power for healing, protection, and guidance that they believed would serve community welfare and individual spiritual development. Of course, the most dangerous magical practices involved activities that could attract serious accusations of heresy or witchcraft if discovered by hostile authorities. Some nuns engaged in necromancy, demon summoning, and other practices that directly violated Christian teachings about supernatural intervention. These activities required extraordinary secrecy and political protection that wasn't always available when circumstances changed. The relationship between magical practice and intellectual achievement was particularly complex in medieval convent culture. Some of the most learned and scholarly nuns were also the most accomplished magical practitioners, demonstrating that occult knowledge and academic learning could reinforce rather than contradict each other when both were understood as aspects of comprehensive intellectual development. Still, it's important to recognize that magical activities within medieval convents operated within constraints that limited their expression and development. Even the most accomplished occult practitioners had to maintain at least nominal conformity to orthodox religious expectations, and direct challenges to Christian theology could result in severe punishment that few nuns were prepared to risk. And yet, the cumulative impact of centuries of magical practice within religious institutions was significant for the message, preservation, and development of European occult traditions, techniques, texts, and knowledge systems that were maintained and developed by medieval nuns influenced later magical movements in ways that are still being discovered by scholars of esoteric history. By the 14th century, some convents had become centers of alchemical research that combined spiritual transformation with practical chemical experimentation. Nuns who managed convent kitchens, breweries, and pharmacies developed sophisticated understanding of material transformation processes that could be applied to both practical and magical purposes. The laboratory techniques they developed often anticipated later scientific methods while serving occult goals that reflected different assumptions about natural causation. The herbal knowledge that many medieval nuns possessed enabled them to practice forms of natural magic that used plant properties for purposes that extended far beyond simple medical treatment. Love potions, curse-breaking remedies, protection charms, and divination aids that utilized carefully prepared plant materials represented sophisticated applications of botanical knowledge that required years of study and experimentation to master effectively. Meanwhile, the artistic and craft skills that nuns developed through creating illuminated manuscripts, textile work, and decorative objects often incorporated magical symbols, protective designs, and occult correspondences that enhanced their spiritual and practical effectiveness. These works served simultaneously as artistic achievements and magical implements that demonstrated integration of aesthetic and supernatural concerns. The correspondence networks that connected different convent communities sometimes facilitated exchange of magical knowledge, occult texts, and supernatural techniques that created informal scholarly communities dedicated to esoteric learning. These networks enabled collaborative magical research that enhanced individual practitioners' knowledge while preserving dangerous materials through distributed storage and copying. Still, the most profound impact of magical practice within medieval convents may have been its demonstration that women could master complex knowledge systems and supernatural techniques that official culture claimed required male intellectual authority and clerical mediation. These historical examples of female magical accomplishment challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and spiritual capability that influenced broader discussions about women's intellectual and religious potential. the persecution that some magical practitioners within religious communities eventually faced during the later medieval witch trials reflected growing anxiety about female supernatural power and institutional autonomy that threatened both religious and secular authority structures. The knowledge and techniques that medieval nuns had developed were often targeted for elimination, precisely because they represented alternative sources of spiritual authority that couldn't be easily controlled or suppressed. The ultimate legacy of magical practice within medieval convents isn't its specific techniques or beliefs, but its demonstration that spiritual experimentation and intellectual curiosity could flourish within institutional frameworks when supported by appropriate resources and community protection. These historical examples continue to influence contemporary discussions about spirituality, gender, and knowledge that transcend traditional academic and religious boundaries. So, where does this leave us in our journey through the cloistered corridors of medieval convent life? Let's be honest. If you started this exploration with simple assumptions about medieval nuns as either universally saintly or uniformly corrupt, you've hopefully discovered that the reality was far more interesting, complex, and recognizably human than either stereotype suggests.